So probably, Catherine, what we'll do is we'll both introduce ourselves and what organization we're with. Okay, so my name is Paul Flansburg. I'm with the Police Accountability Board Alliance, along with Katherine Denison. Say hi, Catherine.
I'm also with Enough is Enough.
Exactly. We're both with representing Enough is Enough. And a fellow board member is Dave Sutlafatis, who's also with the Green Party. And Dave Sutlafatis kindly is allowing us to, he's running the slide so that I can talk about it along with Catherine, providing some pointers. Anyways, so the Police Accountability Board Alliance wants to present you with the Police Accountability Board. And here's what's happening with them right now. Next slide, please. Okay, we are the Alliance, Police Accountability Board Alliance, or PABA. We're under a little bit of discussion now as to whether or not we're going to change that name, but for now we're the PABA. And we basically provide information in an outreach format to our community at large. And one of our outreach efforts is to the community who supports us, and that includes the Green Party. Next slide, please.
Wait, I've got something to say.
Go ahead,
Where
Catherine.
it says members come from, and it lists 3 groups. That was about a year ago, that those were the 3 fundamental ones. But now there are dozens and dozens and dozens of members from all sorts of groups. And if you folks aren't part of that, you can be if you wish. Are you already? Have you already signed on? Oh yeah, you are.
The Green Party is definitely.
Yeah. So that list, I just haven't figured out how to make it large enough to be read and yet incorporate everyone. So
yeah, there's dozens of us now, aren't there? Isn't there, Catherine?
Yeah.
And only Enough is Enough is just part of the Alliance. Okay, next slide, please. So why do we need a Police Accountability Board? Well, if you've heard the news lately, there's been a lot of police circumstances which have been caught even on video, and nothing's happened. And only with basic public outcry has the legal system decided to do something about it. So we're basically the community who's saying, you know what, we want accountability, and the police aren't doing it themselves, so we're going to help. So we're a bunch of citizens, and it's just, we're basically, we're tired of the low morale. We want to be able to trust our police force, and we can't. So if they're not holding themselves accountable, then maybe we can. Do you want to add anything, Catherine?
Just that many of you already know some of the motivation to have Police Accountability Board, and our job as the Alliance is to help promote, as we're doing here, the existence and the actions of Police Accountability Board. So these are reminders of the things that the PAB is working on and that we're promoting.
Right. One of the, and unfortunately I don't have the slide, this videotape, but one of our founders, Ted Forsyth, he actually has a video of police officers raiding a house. And at the time, the police officer's telling someone what to do, and he says, quote unquote, "You will not be held accountable." You will not be held accountable. That's police telling the police that. So we're saying, you know what, you're going to be held accountable. Okay, next slide. Dave, next slide, please.
That is the next.
I want to say one thing. Under disciplinary authority, most of you have probably heard that the Locust Club challenged that successfully under Judge Ark, who is famously accommodating to the police. And that case has gone before the appellate court. Yesterday was the hearing, and it went quite well. The police accountability, I'm sorry, the police have very little to say about it, except that it doesn't correspond to state law. And Shelley, the attorney on behalf of the city, had several points proving otherwise. So we're hoping, it looks like there's a good split of 3-2 of the judges, and it could take
early indicators.
Hmm?
So I just want to add one more thing, Catherine. So basically, this is what the people voted for. You can see there's independent investigation, subpoena power, and compelling witnesses, conduct hearings, discipline authority, and evaluate systematic patterns and practices of the police department. Now, of those things, the one thing which is being challenged in the courts that Catherine alluded to is disciplinary authority. So we're in the process of establishing that through the court system, and it looks like it's the appellate court, Catherine,
Yes.
is looking at what Judge Ark said, and we're hoping that they're gonna overturn what Judge Ark said.
And I would like to add one more thing. I spent some time with Connor, the new head of the executive director of Police Accountability Board, who knocked my socks off with his capacity to interpret and understand and represent PAB. And one of the things he said is that he had no idea when he first looked at this job what an astounding amount of power it has in contrast to anything anywhere in the nation. And to the point where he doesn't think most people who voted it or voted for it or have to deal with it have any idea how powerful it is, and that it is with these supports the strongest one in the country. So.
Okay, next slide, please. So key individuals and entities in the complaints. Well, of course, there's the people that are complaining and then the police department. But who do we complain to? Well, the professional standards section of the police department, and the Rochester Police Chief himself, and then the Civilian Review Board. So these are all what's currently in place in terms of the individual entities involved in complaints. However, we have now added the Police Accountability Board. And we recommend going to an Enough is Enough meeting if you want to help in understanding the options for filing a complaint. In other words, when complainants have a complaint, we at Enough is Enough tried to support them by listening to what they're saying and provide advice on how to deal with that. Is there anything you want to add, Catherine?
No, that's good. I think that these are changing in their power already. So the Police Accountability Board, as it picks up cases, will have far more power over this other existent system.
Thank you. Next slide. So this was the system. And you remember that, so let me just go through really quickly. So the civilian complaints are investigated by the Rochester Police Department Professional Standards Section. Complaints are reviewed by both the Civilian Review Board and the PSS. And the Chief of Police makes a final decision, including how and whether or not to discipline officers. So you can see that the first go-to for anybody to file a complaint is the police themselves with the Professional Standards Section. So what we're trying to do is offer an alternative so they don't have to go there. They can still go there, but if they choose rather to come to us, or well, us, Police Accountability Board, then that's what they can do. And you'll notice that the civilian files a complaint and then it goes to the Civilian Review Board. Do you see any investigative authority by the Civilian Review Board? No, because that's all handled by Professional Standards Section. In other words, the professional standards will investigate themselves and give that information to the Civilian Review Board. And from there, what information is fed to them by the police, they make a decision. Okay, next slide. So let me just go back. So I want in the previous slide. So this is kind of clear, right? In other words, it's the police in the far, who they go to in the far left bubble. And the far left bubble reports to both their boss and the professional standards section. Or I'm sorry, the Civilian Review Board. And by the way, the Civilian Review Board is paid through the spending of that's budgeted for the police. So they basically rely on the police for their funding. That's kind of important thing to add. Okay, next slide. So what are the possible findings? So it goes professional standards, the Civilian Review Board, and then finally the chief of police, and they can either say that they've been sustained or not sustained. How are they not sustained? Either first they could be exonerated, in which the officers decided, in which the officers' effort was justified, or unprovable, meaning, well, they didn't have enough evidence, or basically it was unfounded because it just didn't occur. So you can see how having individual investigative authority might delve a little deeper if something is either improvable or unfounded, according to the professional standards section, let alone exonerated.
Up until now, this investigation is pretty much in the hands of institutional supports that would support the police under any case. So what's happening now, as the board is pulled together now, is that all of these kinds of things are open to the Police Accountability Board, and all of them now can be, they're likely to be much more sustained.
Right.
Many more cases will be proved. There will probably be very few unfounded cases.
So in essence, you can see what Katherine and I have already alluded to is that when you don't have an independent entity to evaluate the complaints, that there's a possibility that these complaints will be not sustained. Okay, next slide. So how often are these complaints sustained? Well, the authors of the research study, which we've used as a basis for the Police Accountability Board, Ted Forsyth and Barbara Lack-Ware has researched all these different allegations of use of force between 2001 and 2016. In other words, these are all the different complaints they've found. And between 2001 and 2016, they founded 923 allegations of excessive use of force. 923.
And remembering that those are the people who had the courage to go in front of police in order to file the reports, which the Police Accountability Board is already working to turn around. So that because people will go directly to PAB, they're expecting that many more people will have the need and the safety to bring the cases directly.
Exactly. Next slide, please. So, of the 923 allegations, the ones in blue were sustained by the Civilian Review Board. Less than 5%, or 43 allegations. Not a lot. Okay, next slide. And of the 43, because remember, it all has to go to the chief of police for the final say, only 16 of those were sustained. So in essence, the existing policy of all the people that were bold enough to go to the police and complain, 920 of them, which are just as Katherine alluded to, short of people who might have had a very good reason to complain to the police, only 16 of them were sustained by the police because the police chief said, you know what, there's something here. Next slide, please. So now we mentioned how, Katherine and I both mentioned how it's important to have independence. And when we look across the country for models of independence, we find one right here in Syracuse, right, a neighboring Syracuse. And there was an ordinance in 2012 which gave an independent department of the city separate power. And in Syracuse, it was an 11-member board with a paid investigator. And they were conducting independent investigation and with the power to subpoena and compel testimony. And with that, look at the sustain rate, 26% as opposed to 5%. Next slide.
Now there's something I want to say at this point. Can you flip back a second? So this civilian review board did not survive. It is struggling to exist, and the reason is that there's not enough money. They had to spend all the money allotted to them to take cases to court, and this is typical of what's going on around the country. And Oakland, for example, has had that trouble, and cases in New Jersey and New York where boards were quite well set up, but they did not have funding. And one of the things that was brought loud and clear when I met with Connor is that we do not have anywhere near adequate funding for what is expected and to enact this very powerful board, which is much more powerful than this one. But we don't have enough. He said, I believe he said that the Parking Bureau has 20 times the amount of funding that the Police Accountability Board does. And that if we were to get even a fraction of that for Police Accountability Board, he could afford to hire 20 people to work on these cases, which would be exactly how to use the power that's there. So this is a thing that, as a takeaway from this program, is that these will fail if they're not funded. Right. So that's our next campaign, and we'll need your support for that.
Thank you, Catherine. Next slide. So we compare Syracuse to Rochester's sustain rate, and basically through 2013 to 2016, it's been 4 times the rate. Next slide.
So of course, this is what the structure of the new PAB is working on.
So they had 26%. Well, let's see if we can get higher than that. Unless, you know, there's no reason. Okay, anyway.
This, I think we covered this one.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we voted for the change, 4-1. Okay, thank you. We can go on to the next slide, I guess. So how the previous system failed the public and favored the police? Well, you recall that I guess there was like 16 cases that were sustained by the chief of police, or was it 13? I can't remember. Out of the so basically there's 43 cases that were sustained by the Civilian Review Board, and of those 43, a fraction of those, or maybe 13 to 16, I think it was 16, was substantiated by the police chief himself. Of those 13 cases amounted to officer discipline, 6 of the disciplinary actions were suspensions, and none, 0, zip, zilch, were fired. Oh, and this is important.
This is that's the target for Police Accountability Board, is to turn those numbers upside down.
And it's important to know this because you can imagine someone feels tremendously at risk by going to the police to complain about something, and then you want to know that the fruits of your efforts found some kind of resolution. Well, guess what? And I'm just going to quote this last statement. Any complainants never learned what discipline, if any, was administered. So maybe something did happen, but was there follow through? No, that's a problem.
And now with the turnaround of 50A, some of you may have worked on trying to get 50A overturned, the law that protects police or protected police against any revelation of any details that would harm their employment. And that was sort of a scandalous law that doesn't exist in many other states. And we worked for years and years to get that overturned. And the governor did it in about an hour. He just decided that was a major focus for him, and he overturned it. So that was a joyful moment. And it means now that complainants will have access to records. It is a very slow process, foiling for them and having to fight for it. But all of that information is now open to the public.
Yeah, and let me just add to what Katherine said, is that because we're going to have a slide for what you can do. Well, basically, we want to sustain the energy behind what passed the Police Accountability Board, and demonstrate publicly that there's energy is still there. That might be showing up for support. Just as we had over 58 overturned, there's still work to be done, because we're still waiting for the courts to validate what we've already decided democratically. Okay, next slide, thank you. So such injustice results in loss of trust in the police department. Black and brown people are needlessly brutalized, imprisoned, physical and emotional trauma, continued abuse by police officers, loss of their humanity. See, it's not just the victims that suffer here, is kind of what that's saying. And then angry communities of color that do not believe in or want to cooperate with the city government. And then lastly, there's a lot of lawsuits. I want to just make a point about the lawsuits, because I brought that up to one of the members of the policeman union. His retort was, well, you're only going to bring things to light and you're going to have more lawsuits. And the point we're trying to make here is if we have a police accountability board with teeth, maybe the police will think twice about causing harm.
And the other part of that is that instead of spending all that money on these settlements, the goal would be to channel that money back into police accountability. And that is on their agenda, to try to reduce the number of suits. And we as citizens are going to need to lobby our council people and press for that money to be diverted into what the program that will cause the lawsuits to lessen.
Right. So there's an animal at play which wants death by lack of funding. So we want to preserve funding and enhance funding for the Police Accountability Board. Next slide, please. Oh, you're rejecting the system. 70% of the voters passed community-based Police Accountability Board. So that's where we get the 3-to-1 margin. So all these things were passed with the vote. And as I mentioned earlier, the one thing that we're waiting upon based upon the challenge of the police union themselves is whether or not the Police Accountability Board has disciplinary authority.
And in terms of the first line there, city agency independent of the RPD. Actually, the law is written so it's independent of the RPD, and much to the shock, apparently, of the city council, it's also written so that it is independent of any city oversight. And you might have followed that brouhaha when Connor was due to be brought on. There was a lot of shock in the city council when they realized what they'd signed. So that is under gentle negotiation, but Connor is holding to the provisions he took his job by.
Yeah, that what Katherine raises is a very important point, because what we were concerned about was basically the focus was on whether or not the ultimate authority to discipline was in the hands of the mayor. So everyone's focus was on whether or not the mayor would lose her disciplinary authority. And so Police Accountability Board said, nope, you're independent. So you're independent of the mayor, but guess what? Independent of more than just the mayor. All right, thank you, Catherine. Next slide. So these are some of the responsibilities of the PAB beyond just the discipline, which we're still in the courts for. And as Catherine alluded to, Connors was telling us these are very powerful things to evaluate powers and procedures, policies and procedures of the police force, to have access to their data and recommend changes. These are all very important things. And it's very influential. Anything you want to add, Catherine?
Just under PAB will have access to RPD officer records. Now the entire community does, but those databases don't always include everything. And I would just say that Enough is Enough is working with a former member who's now in Chicago, who's worked with a group who sets up databases for entire communities. So while PAB will have access to that, individuals who are harmed often don't know, for example, who harmed them because the badges are taped over, or people refuse to give their names or numbers. So we are setting up photographs of people, of officers who won't identify themselves, and linking those and setting that up with their salaries, what communities they live in, what kinds of events have happened, what sorts of crimes or violations they've committed. And all that information will be open to the PABA or the PAB for making determinations. Right. And that's the sort of way that one group can support the PAB, and every other group can help to provide that sort of reinforcements and material help.
Right. So disciplinary records were something that was argued against this because opponents would say, well, they got access to disciplinary records that's under 58 that's protected. Well, as a recognized entity of the city, not under anybody in the city, they have access to those records. But now, as Catherine said, we all do. Okay, next slide. So handling complaints under the Police Accountability Board, as I mentioned earlier, they can still go to professional standards, and professional standards can speak to the police chief, and then a determination is made, but they can also go to PAB investigation. And here's the thing, PAB is going to share with professional standards what they find. They're not going to say, oh, you can't see these things. I mean, that's part of their transparency as a city body. And then they'll make the recommendation to the police chief, and the police chief can say yes or no, but guess what? If police chief says no, guess who has the final say? The PAB. So this is revolutionary change in what was previously taking place, because not only would the chief of police have a voice, but he would not have a final say. It's the board who was chosen by the community.
And as you can imagine, the Locust Club is working this every way they can to keep the public mystified, but this in fact is what the City Council voted for. And the Police Accountability Board is going to be very strong in holding to their position. They're already a very good mix of people aboard, and they're hardworking. By the way, they're the meetings are open to the public unless it's the highly sensitive issue of Connor's approval, but they can be seen online, and the links are on the Police Accountability page.
Okay, next slide, please. So what is the disciplinary matrix? So something's been sustained and there's consequences to that, which, you know, like we said, of the sustained efforts that were determined by the chief of police previously, only so many were even found any retribution. Well, one of the jobs of the Police Accountability Board is to come up with a system. So if you do something, you know what the consequences are going to be. And based upon the severity of these things, the discipline is more severe. And if it's done once and the person's allowed to come back in the force, then he does it a second time, or she does it a second time, or they do it a second time, then, you know, circumstances are compounded. Perhaps the next slide will give us a good example. Next slide, please. So this is just a sample of the disciplinary matrix. And as you can see, if, for example, if a police officer commits a felony, guess what? Maybe that's a good reason to just not let them be a police officer anymore, okay? But then maybe there was excessive use of force, and it was, so conversely, maybe there's excessive use of force and it wasn't deemed to be excessive enough for the person to lose their job. Well, maybe a suggestion might be they be suspended for a while. And then if there's another, and then using that one situation again, if he does it again, maybe we make it more penalty after the second time. And eventually dismissal if it's a pattern. Is there anything you want to say to this, Catherine?
Just that this was drawn up as a way to think about the events, but the Police Accountability Board is right now trying to work on a matrix that is suitable for their power and what they're able to do. And they're just in the beginning phases of this. As they assess who's on the board, we've already had 2 people remove themselves, and some difficulty with one of the participants. His background was somebody who'd been recommended. He had some things in his background that hadn't been understood. So there were 3 basic changes, but the board is pretty substantial now and locked in, I think, for the next couple of years. So they are now able to start with the specifics of how to approach these issues.
Okay, next slide, please. Benefits of the Police Accountability Board. As you can see, improved trust, greater reputation within the city towards the police and its support for the people. We're potentially creating a role model for the rest of the country. We're serving as an alternative to police officers if they're concerned about complaints that were presented and they know that these weren't happening. In other words, if they witness something that's going on and they're not satisfied with the results, and the Police Accountability Board can be an alternative for them. And I also mentioned the lawsuits earlier. Do you want to add anything, Catherine?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
That's all of this. I guess, pardon me, I guess I do want to, as part of the mayor's task force that's been called for by the governor to address police accountability within each community. One of the tasks has been to communicate with the police union, and Connor was pretty interesting in his ability to keep the peace and assess where things are going. And so his emphasis on trust and respect and the service it will have to police instead of against police, which of course is Mike Mazzio's position. This gives some credence to what he said.
Okay, next slide, please.
He's much more at ease talking to Mike Mazzio than I am. I have to wear boxing gloves when I go in, so the blows are softer.
So here's what you can do to support the Police Accountability Board. Let me just add that one of the things when they have press conferences is show up. We have press conferences because this is being challenged by the Police Accountability Board. I'm sorry, by the Policemen's Union in the courts. We want to show them that in the similar way that voters came out to support the board, that we want support for them, not only for the disciplinary power, but for funding. Anything you want to add to that, Catherine?
No, that's good.
And then is it one more slide? And there's our contact information. Police Accountability Board Alliance, there's our website. You can see us on Facebook. And if you want to join, just ask.
And you guys are already members. If some of you here are not, we can get you the application form. It takes a form saying that you, the interest of your organization or you as an independent person in trying to be on the Alliance. And once that's approved, and they usually are, there are a couple of other steps to get yourself in, and meetings are twice a month, and they're pretty fun. So accomplished quite a bit. Lots of committees doing really good work. We're new too, so we're new too, so it's a little disjointed, but it's a really good group of people from many organizations and lots of excellent participation from it. It will make you proud to be part of this community.
Any questions? Do we have time for questions, David?
Oh, absolutely. And I will say that there'll be folks watching this on like our YouTube channel and when we post it to Facebook who are Greens and are not Greens. And if any organizations that they belong to would be interested in joining to the Alliance, like, yeah, like you said, Catherine, the information.
Yeah, so there will be places on both of these sites to indicate interest, and we'll follow through with getting back to you. And if we don't, holler at Paul or me or anybody else, Dave. Or
yeah, don't holler at me, please.
Who's already serving, and make sure you get your application.
And for Greens, currently, I attend most of the meetings, but we could always use an alternate. So if there's anybody who would be interested, who's a Green that would be interested in being that alternate, you could also do that too. You know, who knows, in case I get hit by a bus or something.
Bus or, yeah. Or just collapse from teaching, from distance teaching.
Right, right. Yeah, we more than welcome. We can open it up for questions, and then they can, and folks can ask questions again after Alex's presentation as well. But does anybody have anything right now, a burning thing that you'd like to ask? Okay, well, if something comes up, I hear a voice in the distance.
Yes, it's me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I would just also stress the issue of the governor's plan that he's indicated a few months ago about every county having to have a plan for how to deal with the police by the spring, I believe.
Yes.
And I talked with Ted about this, and evidently there is some representation from us and maybe others who have been going to some of the meetings around this issue. And I think it's important because often what happens in these systems, even though we're one part of the system, sometimes what can happen is other parts of the system, meaning other counties in this case, might come across with less significant approaches, and then what happens, depending on how many, one gets played against the other sometimes, which is what many politicians who do their usual thing like. So I think it's really is important if we really got partly lucky and partly worked at it, that as many of the PABs across the state that would be really, really, really important.
Yes, I agree. And as you mentioned that, I think I'm losing the thought. I'll come back to it, but Yes, I think anything that keeps the pressure both on individual communities and then supports others to join with really strong PABs is good too.
And
Ted's been going to Geneva, and they've been trying very hard to get a system because they experienced tremendous racism and violence from the police there. And they come close and then they get tricked and then they come back in. But participation in this statewide required participation, I think will bring some of the things you're speaking about.
and one more thing about, I'm sorry, Catherine.
Yep.
Are you done?
Yep.
Okay. One more thing, because a lot of there's been a lot of dialogue recently about defunding police. And I think that an example of what's meant by that was pretty well raised during today's presentation. For example, the amount of funds which are accessible to Police Accountability Board to pay, for example, for executive director. And the first thing he mentions is how much more funds are necessary. You compare that to what? The part of the police department in charge of parking tickets.
Yeah.
$10 million. How about you give a little bit of that to Police Accountability Board? That's what we mean by defunding police. Channel some of that revenue to where the community needs it more. Do you want to add to that, Catherine?
No, but I think we've gotten a little off from Cynthia's point. You want to come back and reinforce what you said? I think we're wandering a little bit. Maybe not. Okay.
Okay, are there any other questions? And again, we can go back and revisit it after, like Alex, if that's fine too. So, okay. All right, so Alex White's the next speaker, and he's representing and I'm gonna, if I've said this wrong, please let me know, the De-escalation Committee. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, of UCLM, United Christian Ministry, United Christian Leadership Ministry. I missed a word. I got it.
Ministries.
Yep. And I'll just let him go. I'm not even going to try. I already butchered the name, so I'm not going to try to explain it. Feel free. You're ready.
Hi, I'm Alex White, the longtime Green, and I have been fairly active with the United Christian Leadership Ministry for the last 8 or so years as they've been working on police accountability issues. They have a long track record, just like Enough is Enough does, and they have been instrumental in getting body cameras on the police officers, which give us a chance to see their misdeeds. As a result of our experience in working with them, when Governor Cuomo announced in June that he wanted a collaborative effort for every place with the police department to come up with ideas for changing and fixing some of the problems with police after New York had far too many police killing civilians, UCLM got together and started with a list of 10 suggestions, which we then winnowed down to 3. And the 3 that we focused on were anti-racism training, community input on hiring, and the committee that I have been chair of, which is de-escalation. And this has been an idea that is not particularly new, but got a whole lot of support. And in 2016, when the Police Executive Research Forum committee formed of police chiefs got together and endorsed de-escalation as a primary tactic for use of force. And a number of departments had been doing this for quite a while, almost all of them as a result of a consent decree. And what that means is that something went horribly wrong. The courts had to intervene And the court said, you were going to fix this problem this way. And one of the things to understand about de-escalation is it's not just a training, it's almost an entirely different way of looking at policing. And an example of this, I want to use Denver. Back around 2010-11, Denver had some terrible incidences of police overreach and abuse. And as a result, courts had to intervene, and the courts said, you know, you're going to come up with a de-escalation policy. And some of the aspects which came out, they rewrote their use of force as they were required. And their use of force policy includes the following points: respect for human life. Officers should not engage in unreasonable actions to precipitate the use of force as a result of tactical, strategic, or procedural errors. Individuals are entitled to constitutional rights free from excessive force. It recognizes that split-second judgments will be made, and reasonable inquiry into excessive use of force is objective, not bias based. That should not be biased based on who's looking into it. When reasonable, officers should use advisement, warning, verbal persuasion, and other tactics, including withdrawing. And it's important for officers to bear in mind this is an incredibly stressful situation for the person they're dealing with. And the individual's reasoning capacity may not be at its tops. And they should consider this when choosing the actions that they are going to take. The difference between this and, for example, RPD's use of force is dramatic. RPD's use of force deals almost exclusively with use of deadly force and when it's okay to do so, which seems to be pretty often. The Rochester Police Department manual basically says if the state says it can be used, go ahead and use it. And, you know, no statement about importance of life, no statement about the difficulties, no recommendation that you consider things, nothing. And the de-escalation that we're pushing for is we want it to become a theme of the agency's training and policy for use of force. We want it to include a duty to intervene to prevent other officers from using excessive force. We propose training in field and at the academy in de-escalation. Currently, the Police Training Academy does not have any specific hours dedicated to de-escalation. We would like the hours to be increased to equal the hours training on use of firearms, weapons, and defensive tactics, which is currently 86 hours. They spend 86 hours telling you how to hurt people and 0 hours teaching you how not to hurt people. The recommendation that that the Police Executive Research Forum suggests is de-escalation training be equal to or greater than the number of hours in firearms, weapons, and defensive training. And that's something we also would like to see. We want to increase the reporting on this. We want more review of every use of force, and we want them to we want them to be measured in the results of the measures to be included in reviews of officers. One of the reasons for this is that the data is just amazing. And a little snapshot of that can be found in Dallas. Dallas was forced to put these in, was not forced to put these in. Dallas had an amazing police chief who decided this is what they were going to do. He rewrote the use of force. He rewrote the escalation policy. He fired 72 officers who couldn't get on board with it, which was roughly 10%, 1% of the police force. In the year before this went into effect, 4.67% of all arrests used force. And I want to caution this in that use of force in 2013 in Dallas was measured differently than it was afterwards, and actually was measured much looser. In 2016, that had fallen to 3% of arrests ended in a use of force. But their use of force policy involved counting harsh language is using force. And the previous policy did not. The other departments have seen similar drops, and not only and like in Dallas, other departments have also seen an incredible decline in the level of force used. So in Seattle, for example, a department that's had more than its share of problems, the use of force level 3 includes deadly force and excessive physical force. That accounts for less than 1% of all the use of force in Seattle, and similar numbers can be found in both Denver and in Dallas. Well, their number one use of force, the first level use of force, which basically in Seattle is handcuffing people, accounts for almost 75% of all the use of force. Yes, looking at these numbers from department after department, it was incredible to look at the shocking difference. And now to put this in perspective, okay, in Rochester, almost 6.5% of all arrests end in a use of force. 6.5%. That's some of the highest numbers that we could find in the nation. And again, our policy has no emphasis on de-escalation. There is no training on de-escalation. The department heads do not check into this as a policy. And I know from the release of data in a PSS report that there are more than 70 officers who used force in an arrest more than 6 times in that year, including some that used it 16 or more times, which I would like to say is all of their arrests or very close to it. So that number does not even spark any in-depth investigation in Rochester. That's just a fact of how things go. It doesn't, an officer that has every single time in which they use force when they arrest someone doesn't spark any retraining, any disciplinary action, anything. And the important thing to remember here is that every time force is used, there is a chance of injury or death. And the higher the force level is, the greater the chance of injury or death. And this applies to both the police officer and to the civilian. So reducing use of force is an incredibly crucial element that we would like to see happen in the police departments. And UCLM has made this one of their priorities.
Alex, before you get too far ahead, would you mind backing up just a second? In the chat, someone's asking if you could explain that 75% number in handcuffs again.
Yeah, in Seattle, they have 3 levels of force. And the first level of force is handcuffing a non-willing suspect. Okay, and out of their from 2015 to 2018, they used force in Seattle a total of 7,497 times, and 5,821 of them involved handcuffing an individual, which they consider the lowest level of force in there. And they have 3 levels above that, and each of those levels are the level 2 force accounts for almost all the remaining use of force. And use of force level 2 in Seattle is physically restraining. In Rochester terms, we have 2 levels of force above physical restraining as well. And we don't have any idea what the numbers are because we don't keep track of that. And one of the things we're pushing for is that you have to document, you have to record, and you have to use these records for some purpose, because that is how you keep track of who is actually making which officers are actually not on with the program, don't understand how to do it, have been poorly trained, need retraining, or whatever, is by looking at records about how they are dealing with their arrests and reviewing them. This has been, UCM has formed a committee. We have come up with a report. We're finalizing that. Currently, I could not show the report, but that report will then be submitted to the city and to the state, and it will be looked over by Andrew Como and hopefully chosen is one of the things that Rochester really needs to do. And I think the numbers alone speak to a tremendous need for de-escalation to become a primary factor in all policing, just like the Police Executive Research Forum feels should be true. So, and that's one of the things that UCLM has been working on and trying to get traction on and get changes in Rochester. Any questions?
I have a comment, and,
Sure.
First of all, it was excellent, and I'm very impressed with your description of other cities and how they're handling these things. Locally, our arrests and handcuffing suspects is almost always violent, or in large proportion violent, because of the aggressive approach, the verbal, see, that's where verbal intimidation comes in. Some of our officers approach by threatening to harm the person before they try to even begin to handcuff them. So our numbers in that case would be faulty, because handcuffing is in fact a form of severe abuse, and people's heads slammed onto hard surfaces repeatedly, multiple cops coming to kick and slug somebody. So it's interesting that I think you said Denver, that's considered a very low level of harm, whereas I think here it's the start of very high escalation.
In Rochester, we have a 4-level use of force doctrine, and level 1 is considered no force, and that includes harsh language that includes handcuffing, that includes things that in other departments would be considered a use of force.
Right.
And in Rochester is not.
And that's
And
what,
so, you know, banging a suspect's head on the car or on the pavement is a use of force that's level 2 in our system. And it's hard to make a direct comparison to other places, because my guess is that would be completely non-tolerated in Denver or Dallas. That's just unacceptable behavior. And but we don't. If in Rochester we have a form, the SR form. It's a suspect resistance form. It does not actually deal with the officer's use of force, but with the resistance of the suspect and what they had to do to overcome it,
right.
which is just an entirely different approach to the problem than de-escalation.
Right.
And a subject resistance form is not even needed to be filled out on if all you had to do was take the person down to handcuff them. So, you know, we're measuring apples to
Walnuts.
apples to nothing.
Walnuts to watermelon. Yeah.
Right. There's just no comparison to what other groups are doing. And the level of force used by our police department, if measured similarly to Denver, Seattle, Cincinnati, Trenton, New Jersey, tons of these other cities that have this, the use of force numbers in Rochester would be far higher than the 6.5% that we currently have. And, you know, when you have that level of force, you're going to have a public that doesn't respect or want to work with the police department. You're going to have more injuries. You're going to have a lot more lawsuits, all the things we have in Rochester, and many more injuries and deaths. And the most fascinating thing, when de-escalation was first talked about 20 years ago, the police agencies all said it's going to result in a lot more officers injured. And the data can definitively show that more officers are not injured.
Right.
Okay. Again, you're comparing apples to oranges, but just in a straight rate of number of officers injured per arrest or per officers in the force, that number does not go up. So, you know, this is kind of a win-win here, because the police desperately need community cooperation. They desperately need buy-in by people. And one of the many problems in Rochester is the complete mistrust of the police department by many segments of society.
You probably followed the New York Times coverage, extensive coverage of the Daniel Prude case. And in there, they speak about Rochester having the most violent response to public protests that reporter had ever seen, the one who was harmed, who came here to cover, and who was harmed, as almost all the journalists were, and by the police targeting them. And it was shocking to the people who compiled that report, because of the intensity of our police response.
Well, one of the things, I mean, I want to toot UCLM's horn here for a minute. David Prude never happens without body cameras. Without body cameras, the David Prude event is, he's a suspect who was resisting arrest when he was killed.
Which is how they presented him. Yeah.
You mean the protests, you mean?
No, I mean
the incident itself.
The actual Daniel Prude incident, without body cameras showing what actually happened, the police department would have been able to sweep it under the rug as a suspect resisting arrest and ending up dying.
No, I hear what you're saying, but the way you said it the first time made it sound like you were saying if it wasn't for the cameras, that okay. I thought you meant okay.
But the
I got it. I'm
you
there.
know,
I'm there.
Rochester has a unique place in police disciplinary action, in that we have had a successful lawsuit and prosecution of an officer for misconduct in the Christopher Pate case, where Officer Sipple beats him up with no justification whatsoever. And body cameras again, and to what Paul and Catherine talked about, PAB body cameras are almost a prerequisite for PAB to be able to do their work successfully. And they are going to rely heavily on this. And the department spends, and the union spends so much time fighting back on body cameras. And, you know,
For that very
right, we need to change we need to change the culture here. And, you know, it starts, I know you think it's impossible, maybe it is, but it starts with the officers at the academy being trained the way they're being trained, and then they are shipped off to ride along with officers who treat them to behave exactly as they're behaving, to keep their head down and to follow the rules of the police department or the police union. And, you know, we need to change this culture. We need strong statements like you see in some of the other departments that have de-escalation, about how important it is to respect everyone, to understand the problems that have gotten that person to the situation they're currently at, and to try to resolve this in a way that doesn't require force. And one of the things that was instrumental, this was a point that I pushed for dramatically at UCLM. I wanted this to be one of the points that we emphasized. And I have been fascinated by, I think it's a 2016 incident that happens on the New York City subway, where a bunch of vacationing police officers from Sweden successfully, without injury and with very little force, stop a knifing incident and a fight, and restrain the people until the train stops with no injury and with absolute minimum force involved.
I remember that.
Yes, and it proves that this works and can be done. So and you can't say it only would work in another country, because it actually worked here in New York City on the subway, which is the Wild West of crime, basically. So, you know, we really are hopeful at UCLM that this will be something, and that the presentation we have will be sufficient, with other ones I'm sure are being submitted on similar topics, that we can get this mandated for the Rochester Police Department, because we desperately need it.
Alex, are you on the mayor's panel responding to the governor? Are you part of that task force?
No, UCLM is.
Okay, but you're not.
And I personally am not.
Okay.
UCLM, I believe the committee I worked with on this, excellent people. A couple of them are actually on the RISE committee, and a couple of them are on the mayor's committee.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, shockingly, this was worked out with a couple of police officers and ex-police officers' input, and without them objecting to what is the near final product. So, you know, this is the sort of thing that even non-completely biased police officers look at and are shocked at the result differential. You know, the 50% decline, the 1/3 decline in use of force in Dallas is absolutely incredible in police officers' understanding. So,
with a serious system of measuring use of force.
right,
As opposed
right.
to
It really is probably much closer to a 50% or a 66% reduction if you actually measured the same things.
Right.
And they're aware of this, and one of the members of the committee was absolutely on board of how amazing. He said, I had no opinion of this going into it, and the more I read, the more impressive this seemed to be.
And that's one of the officers saying that?
One of the officers, yeah.
Can you give their names? Do you?
I will not do that.
Oh, okay. It's not public.
No, the members are not.
Then I shouldn't have asked. I didn't.
We had a discussion about I had a discussion about what the presentation was going to be and what I was going to say and what I shouldn't say and whatnot. And I don't feel comfortable revealing the other names of the people involved in my committee. I
just always like to know if an officer said something like that. It's important for me to have that balance to the other things I hear.
Would you like me to put a black box over your eyes so we know who you are?
I did actually say something really good about one of the officers involved at one point, and another one said, "Are you sick, Alex?"
Yeah, that's sort of the way. That's why I wanted to know that person.
Right. But
it was only in good intention.
Well, I'm hoping that when this actually becomes public, which it will probably in early December, that the names of all the committee members will be on it at that point. Okay, that's what I'm hoping.
I assume.
Yeah.
I have a question it starts with Alex, but then it opens up to Alex, Catherine, and Paul. Okay, so the first part of this is there anything we can do to help the committee's proposal become the thing with the governor? And then secondly, just in general with either UCLM or that committee specifically and the PABA, this meeting is for the Green Party of Monroe County. Are there specific things that our candidates can run on to help your agendas? I kind of know the answer to this already, but I'm throwing it out for you guys. And
Catherine?
You're cutting out. I can't hear you.
Oh, I was just giving you and Paul a chance to go first if you wanted to on this question of what the public can do and what a candidate could do. I can take it first if you want.
Go first and I'll follow. I have an idea, but it's not formulated.
Okay. For the public, I believe that I am always a fan of emails and calls to both the governor, who is going to have and to the city. The governor is going to have a public comment period on this, I believe, in March. And when that does open up, I believe the Green Party will put some prompt up there, but people can then go and comment favorably, very favorably, hopefully, on de-escalation as should be the emphasis on police training. As for a candidate, I think this is an issue that you can embrace as something you would like to see RPD change their use of force policy to recognize de-escalation and many of the de-escalation tenets as the primary ways that the police department should approach force.
Okay.
To couple that, I think that I would like to see the emphasis on de-escalation accompanied by other resources. finding resources so that an officer who's armed and under some physical pressure has places to the police don't have to appear at every crisis, and that there would be room for an officer who has appeared to stand down in favor of other resources and so on. And currently we don't have much of that sort of support, interagency support. So it seems to me that would be a very good place to put energy, is to provide. Dave had a question online one day recently, having seen an incident where he had no sense of how to stop something that was a violent altercation between two people. And I attended a workshop about that was presented at a university with several leading people, and they didn't have any idea either. They talked about where we are right now, needing to build up those other resources. But it seems to me one point that would be excellent to accompany de-escalation is participation in community efforts rather than all pressure on the police. Mental health issues and substance abuse issues high on the list.
In Seattle and Cincinnati, they have a crisis. They both have a crisis intervention team, which is supposed to respond to just that sort and take the lead over the police in those instances. And we have the forensic intervention team at the county level, and we have a brand new thing. I think it's only 2 people though, patterned after Cahoots, in which is a thing in I can't remember the town in Oregon, in which they use social workers to respond to 911 calls. And we are trying to pattern that here, but you know, the city wouldn't really put any money into it, so.
Right, which is the local game. There have been other crisis intervention teams, one in the 80s that was very effective for a while and then just didn't get funded and dissipated its force. But it was really great for children's issues, for example, kids who were in either abused or fighting or being abused. De-escalation was a terrific power at that time, but it didn't last long. And now what's left of it, the remnants are not effective. They don't have the personnel.
Yes. Paul.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to just say that there's a lot of different things like press conferences that put issues in the spotlight. So for people in general, show up, go to those press conferences and let people know that you're part of the population, which is in support of making this a significant issue.
So
with
Paul,
sorry.
that, so let's just say I'm someone who's never heard of PABA, or I kind of don't know, or maybe this is the first time I've heard someone from the PABA speak, and I'm like, yeah, I can show up to a press conference. How would I find out about when they're happening?
Well, we have a communications group which publishes these things on Facebook. Sometimes there's certificates require immediate response from the public, and so there's ways of getting in tune. For example, you can get on the Police Accountability Board website, and you'll see a bunch of different things that are advertised, and that's also where the board places their opportunities for a press conference.
Okay, great. That's one of other folks to know. I mean, I would get an email personally, so I would know.
Right.
Somebody else who's watching this might not.
The process is to put those bits of information, including from Free the People, Enough is Enough, and so on the Enough is Enough site, and then share it everywhere. And that would be true of PAB and PABA also.
Sure.
is to get the material, and then all the people who do know something, put the word out to those who might not yet know. So it does work pretty well to get some fairly good crowds, although it is a bit insular. So.
Yeah, insular, that's kind of a concern. But likewise, show up for the people, but also show up for members of the Green parties, particularly if you're running for office. I know I've showed up to a couple different things with Dave when he was running for city council. And it's a way of telling everybody that this is so important to me that I'm going to be here to support you. And at the same time, it raises the question, well, why aren't there other candidates here? And I think that's a very good way of at least juxtaposing yourselves from other candidates. And it's unfortunate that we have a media which is very selective in what qualifies as news and what doesn't qualify as news. So I don't know how to fix the media portion, but I do know that if you show up to different events, that's a good way to let the people know who are very concerned about these things. I think we have relative to getting adequate media attention. That's another issue that I don't know how to tame that animal.
One other thing the public can always do: vote for Green candidates. Almost universally, we support and have been active in police accountability issues for very long time in the case of some of us. And this is some way that you can make your voice directly heard, because almost inevitably after an election, the winners take a look at what the people they beat were saying that they thought was resonating with the public. The more votes that we would get, the more likely the issues that we're talking about will be taken more seriously by the people who end up serving.